I am really proud of the work that we did in 2024. 2023 was an incredibly productive year. We did a lot and we had a lot of funds to spend. So with the surplus in 2023, it was pretty exceptional. And I wasn't sure how 2024 would compare on the heels of that. But we were able to continue the work, further, build on what we did in 2023. And some folks call the even number years bonding years. And traditionally, we've had a bonding bill, although that's been sort of spotty off and on the last decade or so. And we did a big bonding bill in 2023. We did not have one in 2024. But really what this year was a policy year. And I wasn't sure how we would make policy without funds. There were some, we did a supplemental budget, but pretty small, especially compared to 2023. But the policy changes we did, I think, will be really impactful. And they're not quite as flashy or as headline grabbing, but I think really as far as like how Minnesotans live their lives and how government operates, I think we passed a lot of like good governance policy. Right now, fiscally, we have a surplus. Also because some of the bills didn't get across the finish line. So there's even what the DFL trifecta was, agreed upon for spending. We didn't, because some of those bills didn't make it, we are spending even less than we had anticipated. And there is not a deficit for the next biennium. There's a structural imbalance, which I got to learn all about the differences of those. Basically, we don't have a budget yet for 25-26, so there can't be a deficit or a surplus because we haven't made that budget. We know that if things were to continue exactly as they are now, there would be a deficit down the road. So we're being very mindful of that, and we're being really good stewards of Minnesotans' dollars. And what that means is investing that money that belongs to all of us, that is from taxpayer pockets, to better benefit all of us. So things like roads and bridges, and I'm unable to do that just as a citizen. And so that collective coming together and using those funds to collectively better fund our schools, better fund our infrastructure, and all of those pieces. So it's really an investment, even though, what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would say, just give it back. Well, that actually doesn't help the collective of us for the long term. Last year's really big surplus was because in 2022, Republicans walked away from the negotiating table when they had control of the Senate. And, we were this close to passing a bunch of bills, and they decided to take the chance on trying to flip the House and the governor's seats, and then they would have that surplus to do with what they will. I was campaigning and I was hearing about the red wave that didn't come in Minnesota. And so then instead, with the DFL in the gaining control of the Senate, holding control of the House and the governorship, because there was a backlog of the surplus left over from the pandemic, because the state economists and all the budgeting folks decided in the pandemic, well, we need to really scale back our expectations. And so there's all this surplus income for the state and taxes collected. So then we had that to work with, and every quarter, every time that a budget update was given, that surplus grew and grew and grew. And then when it was time, we had the reins, and so we spent, $1 billion on housing. Never been done before in that kind of spending. $2 billion over base on K through 12 education spending. It's still not enough. We've been underfunding our public schools for 2 or 3 decades, so it's not going to get fixed in 2 years, but a substantial investment in our public schools and, the biggest spending on the environment bill. So there was really just a lot of transformational investments that happened in 2023 because of that backlog of lack of coming to an agreement on what to do with the funds in 2020 and 2021. What was interesting, so my mom is a retired teacher who lives in Northfield, and she was saying when she did her taxes this year, she saw a big return in a way that, as a retired person on a fixed income, she had been worried about the taxes on her home specifically. And she said, it was noticeable. I have some more breathing room. I'm sort of less worried about my spending on that. So I thought that was a great sign, because that was a conversation she and I had been having for a couple of years. And of course, that's not just state. There's federal taxes, the local tax, all of those pieces. But she said she could see and appreciate that relief. So I do think there are some kind of immediate things. Other things, like I've talked to folks in, my district has 3 different school districts: the Tri-City United, New Prague area, and Northfield. And there's an increase in funding and the base, per pupil funding. But overall, the number of pupils is going down. So school districts are still trying to work through spending deficits. And a lot of that, if you talk to Dr. Hillman, the superintendent in Northfield, that correlates very strongly with housing. So if there's not affordable housing for working families, folks can't move here. And then the number of our students in our public school systems goes down. So it's all connected. But those investments in housing and infrastructure, in the education system, and we are retooling a state agency that is the Children and Families Agency. And because kids 0 to 5, depending on if they're in the child welfare system or if it was, education or preschool or daycare or in some kind of assistance programs, they're kind of scattered in all sorts of different agencies. So trying to get that all aligned to better serve families. And we know that spending $1 on a kid who's 3 years old will pay off in the long run for them, being food secure, being housing secure, having affordable childcare for that kid and for the working parents. And instead of spending those dollars when they're 17 or 16 and having difficulties or, aren't supported or might not be able to stay in the school system. So that's kind of a generational change that we're hoping that Minnesota can stay on the path because of what we know about child development, that it makes sense to invest those dollars. The earlier, the better. And then we will see greater success rates for young people as they become adults. It was, I like to say, a noisy end to the session. The last night, leading up till midnight, especially the last hour, or I guess maybe half hour between 11 p.m. and midnight. It's so wild that we do business this way. We don't have to do this way. But for at least 2 weeks, there was a very obvious filibuster happening that the Republicans decided to speak on a bill for 8 hours. It just had some technical changes to the paid family medical leave. And I think the original bill that we passed in 2023, in total, I think we only spent 5 hours on the original bill. So to spend 8 hours on a couple of technical changes, as the speaker said, there was very clearly dilatory tactics happening. Even though Republican leadership, sort of was laughing and joshing about the filibuster happening in the House, when we used that word, they got very defensive. It's not a filibuster. It was a 1.5-page bill about disclosing and banning junk fees. Took 5.5 hours, where Republicans were largely talking about hamburgers. There's quite a delightful edit that was made. It's called the Filiburger, to just hear some of the highlights of what was talked about. Really, really unnecessary, all to avoid getting to the business that Minnesotans sent us there to do. So wanting to delay taking up the Equal Rights Amendment and seeing hours and hours and hours of discussion on the agriculture bill, for example, that I was on the conference committee for. A bill we had debated and discussed on the floor previously, then it went to conference committee, then it came back, and folks were talking for hours and hours about pig sweat. Literally, how pigs don't sweat. And their uncle friend who has a hog barn. I mean, it was really not relevant. This is not germane to the topic at hand. And so what happened was all the bills that hadn't got over the finish line yet got put into one mega omnibus bill. And what I heard from folks on the right and their sort of talking points is like, this bill was dropped, and then, we voted on it immediately with no idea what was inside it. And that's actually not true. These bills had been out sometimes for days, but because we weren't allowed to get to them, they were just packaged into one bill that we then passed. And then the same thing had to happen over in the Senate. And so in the Senate, they had never done this procedural move called Call the Previous Question. And they hung together and they were able to do it. And Senate President Bobby Joe Champion, in the Senate, the minority is in the front. And so he was hearing all kinds of loud voices and the majority is in the back. So the fact that they were even able to communicate over all the yelling and all the kind of grandstanding, that was the plan all along, is to make it look like it was chaotic. And these are all procedures that have been used and are part of our being able to get the job done. The minority absolutely has a right to be heard, and the majority absolutely has a right to govern. And that's what it came down to at the end. We only had so many minutes. And so in order to do the business for the people of Minnesota, procedurally, it got a little noisy, but we got our things over the finish line. What was so interesting is when I first thought about this issue, I think a lot of people like the idea of a part-time legislature, a citizens legislature. And in practice now, doing it for 2 sessions, it's not a living wage for a single income household, the way that, rents and mortgages and things cost, especially if you have a single income household and you have other folks in your household. At least not in this district, maybe other places that is true. And then to be able to find other work. Like, is someone going to hire me for 7 months every other year when I'm not campaigning? And, there's lots of ways to figure it out. But when I think about the next generation of leaders, the citizen legislature was made for people who don't look like me, independently wealthy people, retired people, men who have a full-time stay-at-home wife who might take care of the family and such. And that's not an accurate representation of Minnesota. And I would love to make this job more sustainable for someone who doesn't even have all the privileges that I have to be able to do this work, focus on this work, and be able to make a living wage. So although, sure, it would be more convenient for me because I resigned my position at Clean River Partners when after I was elected, but really I'm thinking about the next generations of leadership. And the folks that I would love to be sitting in this chair aren't all those things that I listed. And we need to have people who are younger, people who come from more diverse backgrounds, people who have younger children in the home. All of these things make this job untenable for folks like that. And so I would love to make it more sustainable long-term. And I have this discussion with students at Carleton. I think someone brought up the question. And when I explained it that way, it was kind of a no-duh moment. And again, like I get where people are at because I was there too with the citizen legislature. And I have to say the last month of session, I didn't feel like I was a part of my community here in town. I was in St. Paul, 13, 14, 15 hours a day. It wasn't like I felt really connected to my community. And I think if it was something more like what Congress does, where there are big breaks that you can be back in your district, and then it's it's a more manageable pace throughout the year, then I wouldn't feel like, well, I haven't been in my district for a month. I wonder what's going on, and taking a bunch of time to connect back in. I think that in order for this to happen, we have to have a change to our Constitution. So that is a question that would have to go before the voters, and that's not happening. It's not happening soon, but it is a conversation that's happening, and I think is really interesting. And newer legislators and younger legislators are more and more interested in it because we get to the Capitol and we see that this place wasn't built for us and for our lives. I am really proud of the definition to the public waters that got updated. So this was a piece of legislation I carried in the environment bill. It's a little bit technical, but we have a definition of public waters, and then we have this tool that's a map that the DNR is supposed to keep up to date called the Public Waters Inventory. And it's a map, and it shows clearly what waters are private, like private ditches, and then at what point they become public. And there's a certain definition. It has to drain 2 miles of area. And then that is public waters. That belongs to all of us. And the Public Waters Index was last updated 7 years ago. And there's 640 miles of stream reach that was removed from the public waters list incorrectly. There's a section in Rice County, and there's a section called Limbo Creek. And some folks brought a lawsuit for Limbo Creek, and it went all the way to the Minnesota Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court in Minnesota said, we can't even rule on this. The legislature needs to make clear, is it the Public Waters Index or is it the statutory definition of public water? And so the bill I carried was one sentence that said, if it meets all the criteria of a public water, it's a public water, whether or not it's on the PWI. And a bunch of folks did not love that because of confusion. And I said, yeah, it is already confusing. It even went to the Supreme Court, who said, we got to do something about it. And so a number of agricultural groups wanted the Public Waters Index updated, which is what I want to. And the DNR has had 7 years knowing about these mistakes, and they haven't done it. And so leadership asked, okay, DNR, you need to update this. What do you need in order to do that? And they said $8 million. And the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader in the Senate found $8 million and said, there you go. You have $1 million every year for 8 years. Now go and update the PWI, and then we'll update the statute language as well. And advocates had been frustrated by this process and the lawsuit, and were pretty thrilled that something got agreed upon and decided, and it was a high enough priority to get those kind of dollars. So I'm really hopeful that the DNR will show in good faith that they are working to update the index. I had a bill that I'll be bringing back next year about ATVs in the Northwoods. So right now we have statute and Highway 2. There are different rules about signage north of Highway 2 than there are south of Highway 2. So where we are, if you're going to take your ATV into the woods, you have to go on a marked trail that has signs. In northern Minnesota, if it is not marked, the default is that that's a trail. Excuse me. And so what that means is that people will just make their own trails, and then suddenly there's a trail. And so at least having signage to indicate that, yes, this is a legitimate trail, because what we're seeing is that a lot of these trails are getting made in environmentally, ecologically sensitive areas. I went to Duluth a few weekends ago with my kids, and we were driving back south, and there was a truck with 2 of these ATVs on the back, completely covered in mud, like from the roof all the way down to the tires. If there is that much sediment being dragged up by these vehicles, that's really not great for aquatic life. If there happen to be, sensitive plants or aquifers or erosion, we need to get a better handle. And why would one half of the state have a different set of rules than the other half of the state? And it seems pretty common sense to me and to a lot of folks that we should just have signage for the entire state. And I think probably a lot of folks don't even know that it's a different set of rules in northern Minnesota than it is in southern Minnesota. I'm like, that doesn't seem fair. So there's an incredible group of advocates, of citizen folks who have been working on this tirelessly year after year. We did have a hearing this year for the first time. And the environment chair, should the Democrats retain control of the House, is game to bring it back up next year. And we did all kinds of compromise. There was sort of a four bullet point plan, and the only part that remained was signage. And then that couldn't even get across the finish line. So I'm excited to go back and fight for the land that is public to all Minnesotans and not just exclusive to ATVers. Plus, if the land is all torn up, why would that be interesting to ride on anyway? Like, I just think that behooves everyone. Another piece of legislation is outdoor school for all, maybe the most bipartisan piece of legislation that was introduced. 2 bill jackets, almost all the way full, almost 50-50 of Republicans and Democrats. And this is to make a fund of a pool of money that is a grant funding, essentially through the DNR, so that schools can apply to get funding to go to an overnight environmental learning center, residential environmental learning center, for either 2 or 4 nights. There are a number of schools that have been going for decades and decades, but that's quite the financial burden on families. And so we see the same types of schools being able to go and other types of schools being unable to do that. So making sure we can pay the teachers and the chaperones when they're there, try to reimburse for transportation, which we know is very costly, and then be able to pay the residential environmental learning centers to provide this life-changing experience for the youth in Minnesota. We have hunting and fishing in our Constitution, and kids are outside. I think I heard a statistic somewhere, they're outside 7 minutes a day, and they're looking at a screen for 7 hours a day. And if we want to continue on with our outdoor ethic, whether that's learning about hunting and fishing and gun safety, whether that's learning about the ecology of the different places they are, or rock climbing or ropes course, or all of these developmental things that really dovetail with outdoor education, we need to be doing that if we want the the culture of our state to continue. And so that's why it's incredibly bipartisan, and it's not forcing anybody to do anything, but creating a pool of money for schools that are interested to try to get that funded for them. Well, one of the main reasons that I ran for office for my first time and ended up with this gig, which I'm incredibly grateful for, is I believe in people. I believe in people power. I believe in democracy. And I think 2024 is another one. I mean, we've been hearing this for ages, right? The most important election of our time. Democracy's on the ballot. So I haven't run before in a presidential election year, and will be very interesting where the chips fall. And of course, people are thinking about the presidential election. And for me, I think the closer the government is to us as individuals, the more impact we can have. So thinking about city council, thinking about school board, county commissioner, state representative, all of those things are on the ballot, as well as president and, U.S. senator. Oh, and Congress, the Congress people in Washington, D.C. too. But it's really these personal connections where people email me to say, I have this really random difficulty. Can you help me with this? And even if it doesn't have to do at the state level, we can say, here's the person you should, talk to your school board, or, we'll pass you on to Angie Craig's office to help with your issues with the U.S. mail or whatever it is. And I think that I'm hopeful because I believe in people, and I believe that, as Benjamin Franklin said, when asked about what kind of government the founding fathers came up with, he said, it's a democracy if you can keep it. And I will be working my tail off to keep it, to make sure people feel like they are represented and they have a choice in their leadership, and not that being decided for us. So I'm optimistic that we take the control and the power of the franchise and being able to vote, and take that to protect and expand democracy here in Minnesota and across the country.